Hello, my name is Nick Norby, and I'm the host of History Up in Smoke, cigar chat of classical icons, where I discuss individuals from all epochs of time. In this installment, I'm going to be talking about the most famous American in our country's history. He was the first in war, the first in peace, and the first in the hearts of his countrymen, His Excellency, George Washington. But before we talk about Washington, let's go grab a cigar. I decided to go with the Cohiba Talisman 2017 limited edition. And this is a premium cigar. When this cigar initially came out, it retailed for about $80. However, Habanos re-released this in 2019 and it was selling for about $100. As of recently though, if you're trying to get your hands on one of these, you're gonna pay a minimum of about $130 to $150 per stick. Now, it's a beautifully sized cigar. It's about 6 inches and 1/8 with a 54 ring gauge, which is something, the thicker ring gauge is not that characteristic of Cuban cigars. It's a rather recent phenomenon. Cuban cigars historically have always been pretty narrow and smaller ring gauges on them, but with the New World cigars gaining a lot of traction and popularity, the Cuban cigars started making thicker ring gauges as well. But it's got a nice little pigtail on the end of it, as you can see as well. And when you're cutting these, you don't need to be overly cautious. Just snip right at the top where the pigtail is. If you're really brave and you want to twist it off, you can do that. Not something that I would recommend doing, but look at the construction of the cigar. It is absolutely marvelous. Just the visual component of this as I look at it, it's part of the ritual of preparing to smoke and consume a cigar is how it looks aesthetically and pleasing to the eye. It's just something that I think a lot of people, when they pick out their cigars to smoke them, they do it based on how the cigar looks. So that is part of the experience as well. But it has these beautiful bands on it as well, and you can see it says edition limitada or limited edition, and that usually means that it's a one-time production. But like I said, these were released twice because of their popularity. Now, when something is a limited edition, it is a select aged tobacco that has been harvested from a single crop and is designated specifically for one cigar. So there's not other blends of tobaccos, like New World cigars from Dominican or Nicaragua, things like that. It's just one source of tobacco. They're aged about 2 years and they're housed in optimal conditions where the humidity and the temperatures are all perfectly set for the tobacco to age and cure. As I smell this, very good smelling cigar. I noticed right away leather, a little bit of cocoa, but an overwhelming amount of a woody aroma. I think that's because this has been sitting in the humidor right on the Spanish cedar wood, which would definitely give it that woody note that I'm getting from it. But again, sniffing a cigar, smelling it, another part of the cigar ritual. Your senses are all getting involved and they're just preparing you for what you're about to consume. And that's part of the experience as well. And I just love how everything is involved. Now, I'm gonna do something a little bit different tonight that I haven't done in some of my previous installments, and that is I brought with me a very good whiskey. If you can see that on there. That is George Washington, and that is a whiskey from Mount Vernon, Virginia. It's very special. George Washington had multiple farms. He didn't just have Mount Vernon. He had different satellite farms throughout the area, and one of those was Dogue Run, where the grist mill and the distillery were. And Washington, he moved from the tobacco business into the grain business fairly early in his life because it was much more prosperous for him to get into the grains. But the grist mill that he built could produce anywhere between 6,000 and 8,000 pounds of cornmeal and flour per day. That is an awful lot. And by 1797, one of Washington's farm managers, James Anderson, actually tried to get Washington, or at least he was trying to convince him to get into the whiskey business. Washington was very hesitant at first, didn't really see it being very lucrative for him, but eventually Anderson convinced him, and their first year they produced about 600 barrels of whiskey, which isn't a lot, but by 1799, Washington actually had the largest distillery in America. They were producing over 11,000 gallons of whiskey per year. That is very, very large. So they were doing very well. Unfortunately, in 1814, the mill and the distillery caught fire and were burned to the ground and did not exist. Now, by 2007, the grist mill was actually rebuilt and reconstructed over the original base where it was built, which is really cool. And they had all of the information with regards to how it was structured, how it was built, what it looked like. So they were able to replicate that almost verbatim. And one of the things that they started doing at the distillery was creating the whiskey the exact same way that George Washington did. They had his recipe. They were able to track it down through the ledgers, and the only difference between what we are drinking tonight and what George Washington had then was this is barrel aged for 4 years. This is a premium whiskey. It has a beautiful, let me grab it again here for you. It has a beautiful amber color to it that just looks absolutely wonderful. I hope I can pick that up in the camera. But we're gonna try that tonight. And you know, one of the sad parts of the whole thing is Washington didn't really get to see this all come to fruition. In 1799, George Washington passed away. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about tonight. I want to talk about his life, his legacy, and his subsequent death. So I'm going to get our cigar lit up here. First, we're going to get a cut, of course, and then we're going to talk about Washington. Now, one of the things you might be noticing is I'm wearing a jacket. And if you don't know where I'm from, I live in Southwest Florida, and it is almost mid-March. I think the last week, we were probably in the upper 80s to low 90s every day for temperature, which was actually above normal. And last night, I was even with some friends. We were out at the world-famous cigar bar at Gulf Coast. We were in shorts, t-shirts, and a cold front came through today, and my goodness, the weather just dropped out from the bottom of us. And yeah, that's why I'm wearing a jacket. Under normal circumstances, I might wear a jacket once or twice throughout the year. And this on the coldest nights, and this is one of the coldest nights. Oh, got a little excited there. Got really excited. That first draw, absolutely delicious. The draw's a little bit snug. It's okay though. I don't need to do any operations on the cigar or cut more off the band. I think as I get going here, it's going to open up a little bit better for me. You can see, I don't know if the camera can see really well in there, but it's pretty tightly packed. And again, that is something that is very characteristic of Cuban cigars, is the draw. Sometimes, more often than you want, it's not good. But like I said, this one isn't horrible. It's definitely doable. Let me see if we can get some good flavors out of this. Very characteristic of a Cuban cigar. Good smoke output too, by the way. I get that graham cracker. A little sweetness on the after. Um, little florally with a little bit of cocoa. It's there, it's all there. This is a good cigar. Tell you what, we're gonna pause for a few minutes. I'm gonna enjoy about the first third of this, and when I come back, we're gonna talk about Washington's life, his legacy, and like I said, his death. Stay tuned, I'll be right back. Absolutely buttery, smooth, creamy flavor in this cigar. As of right now, it is exceeding all of my expectations. I'm really, honestly, thoroughly enjoying this Cohiba Talisman cigar, 2017 limited edition. You know, one thing I really enjoy about certain cigars, it's a characteristic that some people don't like, but I like the actual smell of just the smoke itself as it's coming off of the cigar. Some cigars aren't very good, but when you get a premium, nice cigar like this, not only is the tobacco that you're consuming and taking in wonderful and tasty, but it also smells just absolutely beautiful and just downright tasty in my own thought and mind. I really, really appreciate that, and I like that about this one specifically. Draw is still a little bit snug, but again, like I said, that's okay. I'm not going to fret about that. Now, I did grab a nice little bit of Washington's 4-year barrel-aged whiskey that I'm going to nose real quick. Oh, very florally and oaky. Now, this was barrel-aged, like I said, in oak casks for 4 years. That's what gives it that dark amber look as well. We're gonna go ahead and try a little bit. It's good. Very good. Almost has a little bit of a sweetness to it that I really, really like. And it cleanses the palate when you're smoking the cigar, which is nice. It helps you get a better taste for the cigar as well. Some cigars pair really good with whiskeys. Some are better with rum, some with a port or a nice wine. You really got to kind of do some testing to see what pairs best with what. On some cigar websites, they'll actually try and drive you in the right direction and tell you, hey, this cigar probably goes best with a nice glass of wine, which really helps the consumer as well. Very nice. Very nice. Where were we? Okay, yes. We were talking about, or we introduced His Excellency George Washington. After Washington's death, at his eulogy, one of his good friends, Harry Lighthorse Lee, who was a friend of Washington's through the entire Revolutionary War and until the last day that Washington was alive, said this. He said that Washington was the first in war, the first in peace, and the first in the hearts of his countrymen. And I think that that is so true about Washington because he was the greatest of the American founders. And this isn't something that modern historians sort of impose on Washington because he was the first president and the founder. No, these are what contemporary people were saying about Washington during his time as well. But by nature, George Washington, he was a farmer through and through. The guy, he loved and cherished more than anything his humble abode, Mount Vernon in Virginia. He had inherited it from his late brother, half-brother, Lawrence. And after Lawrence's wife passed away, Washington was able to take the entire farm for himself. He built on many additions and wings. We're not going to get into that part of it. But Washington, this was his happy place. This is where he had true peace and tranquility. And it was sort of stress-free living for George Washington. I mean, during the Revolution, he wrote about Mount Vernon almost as if he was there in some of his letters, instructing on, you know, what to do with this and that. And you could just tell he really, really thought and loved Mount Vernon very specially. But Washington also loved his country. He loved America more than anything else. He put it before his farm, his family, his own life, everything. He loved America. And when war was pretty much going to be imminent with the British in 1776, Washington was chosen by Congress to lead the Continental Army. He was the commander-in-chief. He was going to be the person to lead America. Now, I said Continental Army. This was not an army. This was a complete mishmash of farmers, bankers, old men, bakers, candlestick makers, and everything in between. It was a ragtag bunch. They got made fun of consistently and constantly. A lot of them didn't have weapons. They used pitchforks, sticks, whatever they could to fight the war, but they also loved their country and were willing to die for it. But Washington didn't need to command the army. He was one of the most wealthy men in all of Virginia. He could have sat back at Mount Vernon, retired, and been a British loyalist for the rest of his life and lived just fine. But that wasn't Washington. And when he was given the command of the Continental Army, it wasn't something that he sought after like people, for example, Horatio Gates or Charles Lee. They wanted power, they sought power. Washington allowed the power to come to him. He never sought after it, which is a really interesting characteristic that you don't see in a lot of human beings today. Now, after a long-fought war with the British, and the British essentially giving up, the Americans emerged victorious. And one of the coolest things that George Washington did was, after the war was won and the last British ship left, Washington relinquished his power. He took his sword, set it before Congress, and said, "Here, I'm giving the power back to you guys." Even though Washington had full command of the army and he was so loved by them, they would do anything that he wanted for him. Well, Washington retired at this point in time. His retirement didn't last too long before he was called back to duty. America needed a president, and George Washington and his services were needed for America. More than anything, the country was in an extreme fragile state at this point in time. And they needed a leader. They needed somebody like George Washington to take them forward into the future and be sure that the country didn't fall apart, that it kept going strong. And Washington had all the abilities to do that. He had the abilities to delegate different positions to different people that could handle specific jobs. And he did an absolutely phenomenal job at it. And by the way, Washington, when he was elected president, it was an absolute landslide. He's the only president in American history that has won unanimously. No contention, Washington was president. But after Washington's second term, really nice. Really enjoying this. But after his second term, Washington did something, again, that blew the minds of people. He relinquished his power. He could have been anything that he wanted to be. He could have been king. He could have been a dictator. He could have ruled as president as long as he wanted until the day he died. You know, King George said this about Washington before Washington gave up his power. He said, if George Washington, King George was the king of the British, or Britain, and the British Army at the time, and he said if George Washington gives up his power, he'll be the greatest man that ever lived. And George Washington did just that. He again, like I said, relinquished his power and gave it back to the people, and he really set a precedent for all future presidents in that after a couple terms, you have that transition of power, And you have a republic where people vote and they get to choose who the next president will be. So it's just really something great that Washington did. By this time, I think I didn't get a lot of smoke there. Went down my throat. Washington's in the twilight of his life. Right now, he's probably about 65 years old. He's retired, and he wants to spend the rest of his days unbothered at Mount Vernon with his wife and his family. That's all Washington wants to do. Sadly, barely 2 years into his retirement, George Washington would pass away. I'm going to smoke a little bit more of this cigar, and when I come back, I want to talk about Washington's subsequent death and the mark that he left on America that has went on for centuries past. So stay tuned. If you're smoking a cigar, enjoy a little bit more of it, and when I come back, we'll pick up where we left off.